Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Truck drivers, what's a creepy story you've got from the middle of nowhere? Episode 5. I drove a tow truck and one time I pulled into a really secluded rest area looking for somebody who called me needing a jumpstart. He said he was in an Altima, so I pulled up, it's pitch black, and I see just a Nissan Altima sitting there. Nobody else. So, I hop out and start walking up to the vehicle. Looking in with my flashlight, nobody is in the driver's seat, but I do see a pair of legs in the passenger seat. Legs with fishnet stockings on. I slowly walk up to the window and lean down, shining my light up to see an older, probably 60s, man sitting there in women's underwear and fishnet stockings. He is just staring at me, terrified. I turn my light off, get in my truck and drive through the rest stop to see the Altima that needed the jump start about 100 yards up. Very creepy and very weird. He was sitting out there all by himself in the passenger seat with the vehicle off, no lights, no AC, nobody around for literally miles. Who knows what he was doing? This rest stop didn't even have restrooms, it was just a place to pull off the interstate and rest. Crazy. I was driving from Stillwater, Oklahoma, to Tulsa, Oklahoma with my brother and sis-in-law to catch a flight. It was around 2 a.m. in the middle of nowhere and raining very heavily. We have not seen a house for at least 20 minutes. A guy in a white shirt and blue jeans is walking in the middle of the road on the opposite side. When we saw him from distance, we thought it was something else, but as we got closer, all three of us looked in disbelief as this guy was walking in the middle of the road on a highway when it was raining heavily. Did not see any cars parked, pass by or a house for the next 15 minutes. I had no idea where he came from. Creeped us out. The first one happened when I was sleeping in my truck behind a Dollar Tree in New Bedford, Massachusetts. My girlfriend was spending the night with me in the truck, and at about midnight we heard gunshots really close by. Maybe 1/4 mile tops. Another time I was at a truck stop in Mitford, PA, and I woke up for my morning routine, but the truck stop was taped off. Turns out somebody came in with a gun just a short while before I woke up and robbed the place. I was sleeping probably 35 yards from the door. There's more, like walking 2 miles in an unfamiliar town, Kent, Washington, our night to find a porta potty on the railroad tracks, but something about people with guns while I'm sleeping just sleeves me out. Not a trucker, but saw some weird thing. Was driving through a neighborhood in Bryan, Texas at like 3 a.m. Took a right turn at a corner, and in the yard of the house on the corner there were 2 figures in full trench coats and gas mask. Like full Cold War era type gas masks. They were standing side to side, shoulders barely touching, facing the opposite way. Me and my friends in the car didn't say anything for the rest of the drive home, we were so confused. Creepiest thing I've seen. Obligatory not a truck driver, but one time when I was maybe 13 I was on a long car trip with my grandparents. While we were driving along, we were going pretty slow as we were all tired. A middle of nowhere area at night, we saw this skinny guy with large clothes and sunken looking eyes running the fastest I have ever seen anybody run. This man was running twice as fast as I ever could. I very much assume it was a crackhead or something, and as I said to someone in this thread, I learned to never underestimate someone on drugs. Was driving south down a Minnesota country road on a foggy morning. This fog clung to your car like wool on Velcro. Couldn't see more than 15 feet in front of me. I pulled to a stop at a 4-way intersection. To the right was a church. Don't know why, but I chose to stay stopped for around 10 or so seconds. As I'm about to turn left, a large SUV comes careening out of the fog like hell, was chasing him going at least 60 miles per hour, from the west heading east. The SUV blew through the 4-way stop and kept going. I'd been through that intersection thousands of times over the years and had never once hesitated to turn left at the church 4-way intersection. My dad is a former trucker, and the creepiest story he told me was when he was running double in northern Manitoba. Right in the middle of nowhere, and there's a hitchhiker. So of course, he started to pull over to pick the guy up, when his partner notices that there's a whole group of people hiding in the woods and tells him to keep driving. He was nearly hijacked. I used to go on my dad's 18-wheeler, and one time we had to go from Texas to Washington, and in Washington we stopped at a stop sign in a 3-way intersection. less than 30 yards from a tree line, and when I looked to my right out the window by the stop sign I saw a woman with long dark hair eating a heart. This was not a Valentine's cartoon heart, it was an anatomically correct human heart. She just kept biting chunks out of it and walking closer towards the road while staring at me, and all of a sudden my dad slams the pedal to the floor and he asked me why I didn't tell him about the guy by the stop sign with a knife. Obviously we saw different things. I was 11, and to this day we haven't spoken a word about it since. Not a truck driver, but once me and my dad were driving to another town to drop off some relatives. I was around 15. Anyway, we saw some commotion in the middle of the road and wondered if it was an accident, as the road is quite famous for accidents. There was a truck standing on the side of the road, and as we got closer, we realized that the accident happened a few minutes ago at most, as there was no police or ambulance there yet. As we passed, we saw it. On the road was a man, or what was left of him, some torn clothes. His torso had separated from his lower body, which was lying a few feet away. The road was smeared with blood and body parts. I think I recognized some organs. There was also a bag that the poor guy was probably carrying. The horrifying part was that we didn't even notice the body until we got too close, because the commotion wasn't too big yet, and as we passed it, the car had been too close. I distinctly remember hearing a sickening crunch. I'm not sure, maybe I imagined it. Dad kept driving, though. Not much we could do except being quiet for a while because of the experience. Not a truck driver, but while I was driving through Nevada during the day a jet flew directly over my car. Scared me because it was so loud. What was really creepy was that while driving back through the desert in the dead of night I saw a deer slowly walking across the road, didn't even flinch as I was bearing down on him. On the other hand, I saw a lot of stars those nights because it was so empty. Not a truck driver myself, but I like to accompany my stepfather from time to time. This one time, we were on this curvy road of just trees, not a house, not even fences on the land behind the trees. As the hours pass I start seeing a man, white rubber boots which were dirty, a vertically striped light blue button shirt, a blue cap, a cloth bag hang from his right shoulder, and a long machete hanging from his dusty jeans. I don't know why I remember him so clearly. For some reason, as we got closer and closer, he was just the same distance. I said, "Hey, we should offer him a ride. It's an empty road far from any town." My stepdad looks over and says, "Who?" "There's no one other than you and me." I said, "There is, look over there in front, the man with the light blue shirt." This kept on for a few minutes back and forth, until the man just disappeared. I said to myself, "Oh good, probably just my imagination." Until blood spots started appearing on the road, I decided not to tell my stepdad because I thought it probably was just an animal which got hurt, or my imagination playing with my boredom, but it never ended, and what made it worse is that when I asked to stop for a second to take a piss, the man appeared again. Only difference was it was on the opposite direction. I said to myself, "Oh, not you again." I decided to not pay any attention to it and just carry on with my business. When I finished, the man was running towards me, and kept getting closer and closer. I got scared and jumped hastily back inside the truck, and told him to start moving because the man was coming. He laughed and told me I was crazy, and that there's nobody. The blood stopped a few kilometers away, and it never came to my mind after that, until my mom told me about seeing the same man, and the same blood trail, on a similar road. It might not be as scary as some others in the post, but it really messes with your brain. Not a trucker, but did my share of time traveling in the northern states and Canada going to rodeos. A few summers ago, I'm heading to a rodeo in Browning, Montana from North Dakota at 2 a.m. with my sister and dad driving. We pass through a small town and it's like the town from House of Wax. We literally see no one driving through. We get just outside of town, take a curve, and right there, in the middle of the road on the double lines, is a man standing with his arms spread and his mouth open, looking like he's yelling. My dad jerks the wheel just in time and we just about hit him with our mirror. Good thing our other family members had taken the horse trailer with the horses in it earlier in the day, or we would have definitely flipped. We were supposed to hit a rest stop after the town and sleep till the morning, but none of us could sleep until after the sun came up. Maybe the guy needed help, but I've seen too many scary movies to help a random stranger in the middle of the road at 2 a.m. 10 years later and I can still remember the man's face. I worked as a driver for several years OTR. Drove nights a lot as a team driver. Out west always freaked me out because you can literally go miles without seeing anyone or anything. One night I was driving at 3 a.m. and saw several objects in the sky, chasing one another, doing maneuvers that no human could stand G-force-wise. The objects almost glowed from within. Pretty crazy stuff. And luckily my co-driver was with me and saw them as well, so I didn't feel as crazy. We didn't talk about it much and there was complete silence a while after. I feel the best way to describe the feeling is almost as if seeing a ghost. It changes your perspective on the universe quite a bit. Wasn't me but my dad. He was driving a long haul through the middle of nowhere, aka Wyoming. But as he is driving, he notices that the sun is setting. So, he pulls over for the night and takes a break. The next morning, he wakes up to strange noises. He looked around and saw 3 to 4 people trying to sabotage his load. He was carrying something highly flammable but said he couldn't remember exactly what. They were trying to light his load on fire. But before they could succeed, he pulled out his concealed carry and fired a couple warning shots into the air. He is against hurting people, so he didn't actually aim for anyone, and they fled. Had he not woken up, they likely would have succeeded and him and his semi would have been reduced to smolders. Thanks for reading. Safe driving. Not a truck driver. Back in Laos 2004, we usually commute via motorcycle. My 2 friends were riding after dinner and had a few beers. The road was isolated, most streets have no city lights. My friend pulled on the side to pass really quickly while the other drove slowly for him to catch up. Back on his bike, he drove off. A few minutes later, he noticed a lady, long hair, and an all-white dress in the middle of the road. He stopped and asked if she needed a lift. She didn't answer. Suddenly, my friend noticed her dress and her silence. He freaked out and sped off ASAP. Arriving back in the inner city, he called me to have a drink. When I saw him, he was just in shock and stressed out. He said that he may have urinated outside the cemetery. This was why the lady in white dress showed in his patch. White dress in Laos is for funeral. My other friend didn't see anything at all. Not a truck driver story, but a high school teacher told us this story that has stuck with me since. I believe in him 100%. He was driving alone on some tiny highway in Montana, I believe. He picked up a hitchhiker who was a guy in a nice suit. The guy didn't talk to him as they drove, but suddenly asked him to pull over. The man sprinted straight out into the desert while my teacher sat and waited and wondered what just happened. Finally, he decided to drive off and leave the man, and as he was driving away he sees the man running behind him, on all fours like a dog, in a full sprint. He said he drove as fast as he could. He thinks it was the devil. A few years ago, in October, I did a cross-country road trip from Georgia to Alaska with my dog. I was moving for work and decided the best way to get a fun/money-saving experience was to bounce from national parks and KOA campsites and tent camp my way to Alaska. So, I sold most of my stuff and took about 2 weeks to drive around the country on my way up north. On about my 5th or 6th night on the road, I stopped in Oregon at a little campsite I'd found while I was Googling cool places to stay back in GA. It's a beautiful campsite, backed up right to a nice little creek and only about a 20-minute drive from the highway. Plus, we had it all to ourselves. It gets a little chilly in October, but I expected to see at least one other person. There's still time for some other campers to show as I had gotten into the camp a little earlier than expected, so my dog and I walked around for a little bit before I set up my tent and cooked some dinner. Well, it's still only midday, so I figure I'll drive to a gas station and fill my truck up before I set up camp and make dinner/get cozy in a tent. That way when we get up to leave in the morning I don't have to stop, and we can get right on the road. Now I'm faced with a choice. I can head back the 20 minutes to the highway, get off on one of the next exits and get gas, or I can go deeper down this side road into eastern Oregon backcountry looking for a gas station. Well, I'm a bit of an adventurer, so the choice was obvious. I set down this back road for about another 15 minutes drive, not a business or home in sight, and eventually get to a rundown wooden building with the old-style gas pump out front. Perfect. So, I pulled into the dirty parking lot and cracked a window for my dog, then I got out and walked toward the building. As I'm approaching the building I remember thinking it was strange that this tiny old wooden building had weird-looking black splotchy door, but I don't think much of until I get closer. I reach out to open the handle and freeze. The door is not painted black, it's covered in flies. Thousands of flies crawling underneath the door jamb and buzzing around the frame, obviously trying to get inside. At the same instant I hear a noticeably clear and distinct two-finger whistle like you would do to get someone's attention. I turn around and in between me and my truck is an older man wearing flannel and work pants on a four-wheeler with a small dog sitting on his lap. He sternly asks me what you are doing here? And I explain very quickly, I just came this way to buy some gas. He lets me know they're closed and suggests that I go back to my truck and go home. So, I slowly walk past him and this tiny dog, who I now realize is missing an eye, and get into my truck and pull out of the parking lot. He sits in that spot on the four-wheeler and watches me until we finally lose sight of him in the rear view. I drove straight past the site I had previously selected to camp only 15 minutes up the road, and I hit the highway. After stopping for gas, I camped on the Washington border that night. Even if it was a misunderstanding, creepy. Also, some of the most fun 2 weeks of my life. Those of you considering it. Driving across America is beautiful and lots of fun. A friend of mine was getting into her car after work one evening when a guy approached her. He was wearing a shirt and tie and looked pretty respectable. He told her that his car had broken down and he needed to get into town to call the garage. This was before mobile phones were really around. He seemed friendly enough, so she decided to give him a lift. Anyway, 5 minutes into the journey she realized what she was doing and decided that this might not be such a great idea. She pulled up on the side of the road and told the guy that she thought one of her headlights were out, would he mind getting out to check? He obliged, and as soon as he got out of the car she drove off. She arrived home feeling a bit guilty for leaving him at the side of the road. As she was getting out of her car she looked at the passenger footwell and realized she had driven off with his briefcase still in the car. She felt awful and drove to the police station to tell them the story and hand over the briefcase. They accepted the story and took the briefcase. Later that evening she received a phone call. It was the police. We need you to come into the station to make a statement. Turns out they opened the briefcase to try and find some form of identification. Only 2 items were found in that briefcase, a rope and a knife. As far as I'm aware they never found the owner of the briefcase. I'm not a truck driver, but I did a lot of hitchhiking back in the late 90s. I've crossed the country from coast to coast 4 or 5 times and been everywhere in between. The best and worst rides were always from truckers. Most of them are good people, and getting a ride in a big truck meant I was going a long way without worrying about changing cars. One night I was stranded at some rundown truck stop in Oklahoma. It was late at night and pitch black outside. The only light came from one flickering streetlight swarming with giant mosquitoes. I'd been there for hours with hardly anyone to even ask for a ride. Finally, a group of truckers came out of the dingy cafe. They were laughing and joking and avoiding me as they knew I was about to hit them up. Emerging from the darkness I walked towards them, calling out as I got closer. Hey, you guys headed west? I asked. Yep, one of them answered as the group laughed and turned towards their trucks. They were clearly not looking for company, especially mine. Hey look, I've been out here a long time and I just need a ride out of here. Don't care how far, just somewhere else. Trying to get to California, but I'd be happy just to get out of here. Can you help me out? Nah. Sorry buddy. They weren't laughing anymore. Everyone knows the feeling, trying to be stern with panhandlers and such so they'll leave you alone. I was desperate though. I knew I couldn't spend the night out there without mosquitoes or coyotes carrying me away. I won't be a problem at all. Just trying to get out of here. I pleaded one last time. Oh, alright, come on, one of them finally agreed. Oddly, the group got their sense of humor back, as they all laughed and began to joke back and forth as though my luck hadn't really improved. Hitchhiking involves quite a bit of risk for both driver and driver. Either party could be the axe murderer that both are hoping one is not. Each time I reached for the door handle I said a little prayer that it would not be a lunatic I was climbing in the car with. I ran to grab my bag, as he hollered that he would come get me in a minute when he was ready to leave. I sat on my bag and waited, relieved to finally move on from that hellhole. About that time, I heard the rumbling of the truck coming through the parking lot. As it got closer I could see the interior lit up a dark red color. Now, feeling the hesitation of reaching for the door, I climbed up and swung it open to see into the cab. The driver was smiling a crazy meth grin and laughed as I noticed a rubber chicken hanging on a noose tie to the ceiling of the truck. Weird, I thought, with no choice but to keep climbing into the passenger seat. Many of them are weird, I worried, pretending not to be scared. But I had been in many odd situations over the years, and always managed a way out if it got too scary. So, I settled in, and we rolled into the bug-ridden night air of Oklahoma. Thankfully, he turned out not to be an axe murderer, though from the speed of his conversation and the weird look in his eye may be partaking in some sort of stimulant to make the dull rides more enjoyable. The ride was worth it. I got all the way to the Salt Flats outside of Salt Lake City before we parted ways. I ended up stranded there again for what seemed like an eternity. This time though closer to my final goal and with a heart full of gratitude to be out of Oklahoma and not dead in a ditch from what seemed like might be a ride with a lunatic. Not a truck driver myself, but this is my creepy story about one from the middle of nowhere. Also, not an English major, so your patience with the grammatical errors of my offering is appreciated. Obligatory not a truck driver. Last Christmas my girlfriend and I had gone to visit our parents a few hours away. We both had to work the next day and we planned to leave the next morning but at the last minute decided to leave that night and just get home at 3 or 4 a.m. Most of the drive went fine, nothing out of the ordinary except being super tired driving on the interstate. Then, we were about 20 minutes from home, going probably 70 to 75 miles per hour, I saw something move ahead on the shoulder between the north and southbound lanes, and right as we passed by I realized it was a man lying on his stomach reaching and waving from the ground, partially hidden by the guardrail. I immediately called the police, but I was absolutely mortified and didn't stop. We were both very shaken for the rest of the night and I've never heard anything about it since. Still spooks me to this day just thinking about it. Not a trucker, but I drive long distances regularly. I was going from Washington to Oregon on a pretty winding mountain road. There was a concrete barrier on the left, I'm assuming it was blocking a cliff. The highway is 2 lanes, I'm in the right lane. As I'm coming up on a turn, I see some bloodied tire tracks leading around it. I assume they're old, but as I keep going around the corner there's increased blood and suddenly I can see a mutilated bear carcass blocking the entire left lane. It was easily as big as my little hatchback and I'm positive if I hit it head-on I'd have died. On the way down the road there was a semi on the side of the road with a police officer, but I didn't see any damage or blood on the semi in my rearview mirror. I ended up pulling over in the next town to cry from the shock of seeing something so grisly out of nowhere, and I called the police to let them know just in case the semi wasn't the one that hit it. That was the most brutal and horrifying thing I've seen in person. Not a truck driver and not really a creepy story, but I've worked at a casino gas station for a couple of years now and this incident will always haunt me. I was working my normal graveyard shift and a trucker had come in for his usual coffee and smokes. He had mentioned a lot of lizard sulking in the shadows, and I reassured him I'd get our detail officers to run her off. As he's climbing back into his truck, I can see everything clearly on camera. I'm explaining to our officer about the woman when he goes, "Oh my God." I turn around to see what he was talking about, and I see not only the lot lizard the trucker was talking about but also, him running her over with his rig and watching as her head essentially flattened into a pancake. Granted it wasn't my first time seeing someone die in our parking lot, but this was definitely the most gruesome. Apparently she tried hiding in between the space of the truck and the trailer, fell off after he set the truck in motion, and got ran over. It was ruled an accident as far as I know. This is more bizarre than creepy. I was eastbound on I-80 in Wyoming, somewhere east of Elk Mountain. Middle of God nowhere. I hadn't seen an exit for about 5 miles, much less a town of any sort. It's the middle of the night, November, and it's snowing. And I pass a guy on a hove round, one of those elderly mobility scooters, absolutely booking it down the shoulder. Now, this guy is older than dirt. Head rolling to the right like Stephen Hawking, his skin looks like leather, and he's got to be going 10 miles per hour on this hove round. Definitely had it set to rabbit. I got on the CB and alerted the police, asked them to do a welfare check on the poor old man. But I still can't figure out where he came from. There were no on-ramps for him to enter from for miles, no broken-down cars for him to have come from. It was 2 a.m., colder than a witch's tit, and slicker than snot on a doorknob. What were you doing out there, old man? I got both zombies and aliens. Wasn't necessarily in the middle of nowhere, but I was a truck driver delivering to a gas station in a small urban area in the Midwest US. It was early, well before sunrise, and I hop out of the truck and there's nobody in my immediate vicinity, and only a couple lights, but I see someone walking in my direction. It's a man stumbling and limping with his head moving aimlessly, and he's wearing a shirt that's been torn to shreds. His arms are out to his side dangling as he walks. It looked like something straight out of a zombie movie. In that moment, I felt more creeped out than you could imagine. This man could have easily been a zombie, but sadly it was probably a cocktail of street drugs. I walked right by the man, and he didn't even notice me. Another time I was driving in western Oklahoma with a coworker. It was late at night, and we were on an empty highway. No cars coming in the opposite direction. It was the dead of winter too, so it was pitch black outside, and this section of highway had no lights. It was cloudy to make matters worse. But we kept trucking, as they say. Then zoom, a bright red light like a laser shot across the sky. It popped in and popped out in less than a second, moving at lightning speed. It appeared, blink in the middle of the sky, and then shot across the sky probably several miles in less than a second, and just blinked out of existence like a light switch. We both saw it too. I know we both aren't imagining this. And there were no other cars or lights around, so it couldn't have been glaring. No jet could move that fast either. 10 or so years ago my brother and I were driving to Walmart at around 1 a.m. to grab some snacks. We lived in a relatively suburban area, but to get to the Walmart we had to drive through a fairly wooded stretch of rural roads. We make it to Walmart, grab food, and head home. Again, we are winding through various hills and dark stretches of densely wooded roads. I get a glimpse of something incredible white out of the corner of my eye and quickly turn my attention to two white humanoid figures walking towards the road in our direction no more than 25 yards away. I look over at my brother in the driver's seat to try and let him know about what I was seeing, and just past him are three more white figures approaching from the other side of the vehicle. I couldn't muster a single word to say. I couldn't make a sound. We were very much still miles removed from anyone at the time of that encounter. We never talk about it. I still don't know if he ever saw what I saw. I will never forget. Not a truck driver. Also, I see that this post is 2 weeks old, but I have a creepy story about a truck driver. It was maybe 2014 or 2015. I was 17 or 18 at the time. I worked at Target in Springfield, Illinois and lived in Franklin, Illinois. If anyone reading this knows where Franklin is, I will be genuinely surprised. It's about a 45-60-minute drive, mostly through long rural roads. The longest stretch is between New Berlin and Alexander, both towns no one has heard of. It's a 2-lane road, so you can pass, but you had better get your car back in the right lane eventually. I had just gotten a CD, Fall Out Boy, from under the cork tree, and I was listening, and maybe singing along, You Have No Proof, as I drove my small black car all the way home. The speed limit is 55 miles per hour, I'm going 60 miles per hour, and I'm coming up on this big white semi-truck. I remember him having a trailer, but I don't remember if it was a flatbed or a box. He's going slower than me, so I slow myself down to match. By the time I'm doing 45, I realize I'm going to be late home, and Mom's going to be unhappy about that. I have plenty of room, no one is coming, and I can pass him. So, I speed back up to 60 and start to go around him. And he starts speeding up too. Now, I know that people do that when you pass them. Happens all the time where I'm from, and even happens where I live now. But this was slightly different than that. He was flooring it to keep up with me. This guy wasn't going to let me get in front of him. Fine. I'll just slow down and have to explain to Mom why I am late. And then he slows down, too. Back and forth, I sped up, I slowed down, and he matched me completely. This guy was not letting me back in the right lane. Now, I'm aware that I am a very stubborn guy, but I had to get back over because I wasn't going to get pulled over for driving in the left lane. And then I saw this truck coming my way. It was a big truck. Rural area, so farmers all have mini tanks that they drive around in to transport their equipment, and their sons all have mini tanks they drive around in to compensate for their lack of equipment. I'm assuming he's going 60 as well, which means, from 2 miles off, he's going to head-on slam into me in about 1 minute. And the semi will still not let me back over. I looked up at the semi driver, and he smiled at me. It wasn't angry, it's scary, it was just a big, happy grin. So that creeped me. So, here I am. About to get in a head-on collision at 60 miles an hour with a truck 5 times my size because this psychopath to my right won't let me slow down or speed up. I'm 17 or 18. I'm panicking because I've never been through anything like that before. And then my radio gets louder. I didn't turn it up, but maybe I was just hearing it clearer, maybe it was a miracle. I don't know. But it's, "Sugar, we're going down," and we're at the part where he just says, "And sugar, we're going down swinging." To this day, that's my favorite part of that song. If I'm going to die on that rural road, I'm going to do it while trying to survive as hard as I could. So, I floor it. I push the accelerator down as hard as I can. I discovered in that moment that when I feel abject mortal terror, I actually start laughing. Which I'm sure is not a bad sign of anything. I got in front of the semi with seconds left. If we had stopped time, I could have reached out of my window and touched the front of that big red truck that was going to hit me. That white semi was just behind me, with his bumper nearly touching mine. I think I reached about 90 and was another 5 miles down the road before I slowed down and started crying a little bit. Might have screamed. I was freaking out, and adrenaline is a hell of a drug. So, it ends there, right? Nope. Semi-dude is right behind me again. He was not respecting the 3-second following distance. He was honking and speeding up, and he nearly bumped me a couple times. There were several stop signs as I reached Alexander that I just blew right through. Otherwise, he was going to hit me at about 60 or 70 from behind. I am driving a tiny car. I would have been smashed like a bug. I think I was doing about 40 or 50 when I hung my left turn to get on the road home, right next to the park in Alexander. Probably should have flipped my car. Another miracle, I guess. Or the fear of the moment has exaggerated the memory. Anyway, got home, told my parents, Dad asked if I had any details, which I didn't, and Mom wasn't upset. Turns out, I made it home in record time. Positive aspects? When I was 22, I was a truck driver with my cousin. We drove team as an owner-operator. I drove nights, he drove days. Anyways, we stop at this rest stop just entering New Mexico, maybe 3 a.m. Some lady comes up asking me bunch of random questions, and I figured she was a lot of lizards or a serial killer. My cousin notices me getting uncomfortable and calls me over. As I'm walking towards the truck, she's just staring at me. I get on, and as I'm getting on, she smiles and says, "Not tonight, huh?" I just take off. Here's the creepy part. 3 days later, entering Tucson, we stop at a gas station, and that is there. I'm assuming she's just a hooker, but it creeped me up. I used to drive late at night across middle Kentucky on a highway. From 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., there is no traffic. Just so happens, a truck driver and I are the only two on the road, and he is keeping pace with me at 80 miles per hour in the right-hand lane. He was behind me for at least 20 minutes, when a large buck deer hopped right out in front of me. Luckily, I was driving a smaller car and was able to avoid the deer. My trucker friend behind me. Not so much. I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of what I assumed to be the spontaneous combustion of a large woodland creature. I stopped and waited for him to pull over and go to check on him. This was a flat front grill truck, and it looked like a cheese grater met the deer. I asked him if he was okay, and he replied, "Yeah, but he isn't." Everyone was fine, but I have always remembered that vividly. Glad I didn't have to clean that truck. I was driving through rural Alabama one night around midnight on my way to a friend's house. Coming through a particularly empty stretch when I looked in my rear view and saw a car coming at me so fast I screamed and braced. I knew I was about to be rear-ended. I still remember the feeling of pure terror. When his headlights hit the point where they disappear under my trunk line, the car disappears. The road goes back to being black and deserted. Still have no idea what happened, but I was visibly shaken as my friends asked me was I okay, etc. Not a truck driver, but every summer from the age of 8 our family would drive to Mexico for vacation. My dad had fixed up an old Dodge Ram conversion van that allowed us to sit 8. We would drive from Texas to Zacatecas and my uncle from Sinaloa would meet us in Zacatecas and drive us to Sinaloa. Well, back in those days, in order to get to Sinaloa you had to drive through the mountains and there were parts of the road that only had enough room for one vehicle to get by. You could literally see down the mountain from the passenger windows in some areas. So, you would have to be careful and keep an eye out for oncoming traffic. Especially if it was a trailer or bus. My uncle drove this road regularly due to being a bus driver. There was one particular part of the road called the Spine of the Devil. It was a small part of the road that bridged and connected two mountains. Normally there were vendors, local mountain people, there that sold food. Almost like a makeshift rest area. People would get out and take pictures. You were so high up in elevation that many times you were in the clouds. Well, on this particular trip when we drove by, there were no vendors, we didn't see anyone taking pictures. So, my uncle told my dad he didn't feel comfortable stopping if there were no locals there. My dad agreed and we kept driving. I don't know how long we drove before I suddenly felt my uncle brake very rapidly. When I moved over to see through the front windshield I could see a little white truck. There was a man with a cardboard sign that said stop walking towards us. Dad said, "What's that?" "Uncle, they put a truck in the road." "Now what?" You want to talk to them, or you want me floor it?" Nah, we aren't taking our chances." "Floor it." "You, okay." As he drove past the guy walking he dropped the sign, banged his fist on the side mirror all along the van screaming blow it, and reached his hand behind him. My uncle hit the truck to get through and the truck rolled down the side of the mountain. Then we heard a pop and a loud bang. We could see rocks falling behind us as drove. We never really knew what was going on. But my dad and uncle were not going to take chances with 6 other family members in the van. The following year we took the bus from Zacatecas to Sinaloa and ended up stranded halfway up the mountain because one of the earlier routes had been hijacked and they kidnapped 4 girls between 12 to 14 years old. I wasn't a big rig driver, but I've driven box trucks from Indianapolis to Florida to North Dakota. So, I've been all over. We used to work in teams of 2. We had a really bad turnover rate because job conditions were bad, and the workload was worse. I remember doing a survey for a restaurant that had closed down in Iowa. Just west of Cedar Rapids. Around 2 a.m. in the parking lot of a Perkins, nothing else around except a family video and a really sorry little park. I'm taking measurements of the windows so we can put up vinyl graphics. One of the windows was smashed in and I could smell the old rotten grease stink pouring out of the hole. I peeked inside and everything had been pushed away from the center of the dining room except one table with a plate and a huge slice of cake on it. Now I could be really spooky and say I'd been hearing sound from inside the building while I'd been doing my measurements. I can't be sure though, it was really late, and I was very tired. I used my phone flashlight to get a better look. The whole area was set for a birthday party, balloons, a banner that said happy birthday, and the floor was covered with confetti. I got a little too invested and poked my head in the hole. That was until I saw the kitchen light flicker on and off. I got spooked. Pulled my head out really quick and cut my scalp on glass. I bailed after that. I said in my paperwork that some of the windows were smashed so I couldn't get accurate measurements. Sorry if you're from Iowa. A few years ago, I was visiting a friend in India, in the rural stretches of Maharashtra state north of Nagpur. He's Indian, and since I'm not, he wanted to show me all the cool things about where he was born and raised before we had met in university in England. He told me there was a village about 50 kilometers away from where we were, in the bush, which had the best food of anywhere he'd been, and he wanted to share it with me. We left around sundown and drove into the night as it got darker. As we were driving we came upon a few abandoned structures at what looked like an intersection. It was September and still very warm and humid, But as we entered that place the temperature went ice cold and I swear that I could see my breath. I was overcome with the feeling of impending doom and that there was a malicious presence surrounding us. I sat there silently, just thinking that maybe I was weirded out by a place that I'd never been to before. My friend was silent for a minute but then whispered, "This is a bad place, an evil place. I cannot explain it, but I think many have died here." That just about made me jump out of my skin. We approached the intersection of another road and we had to maneuver around a cart in the middle of the road. As we did I swear that I felt ice-cold fingers reach through the closed window. The steering wheel of the SUV jerked, and we scraped against the cart on the driver's side. My friend instinctively stopped for a moment, as anyone would if just in an accident. What happened next still haunts me when I think of it. As the SUV rolled to a stop, I looked out the windscreen and there was an entire group of villagers dressed completely in white. They seemed to hover over the street instead of actually standing on it. Their eyes glowed the way that photos used to come out with red eye, and I immediately began crying, and I seemed to be overcome by an ocean of sadness, anger, and only plain terror. My friend put the vehicle in reverse, turned around, and we never went to the village we were trying to reach. We didn't talk about it that night, but in later conversations he said that the ground is old in India, and it holds thousands of years of memories, and you can never be sure of what has happened in places. I don't want to think of what happened in that place. It was as close to hell as I ever wanted to imagine. Not a truck driver, but I worked for a catering company once and they had me drive the truck one morning at like 4:30 to deliver a ton of breakfast to some tech facility with engineers who do military contract stuff. Not a huge truck, but still a truck I had no business driving. They didn't fill in the tank, so I had to pull over to get gas. I was the only person at the gas station and this older white Cadillac with tinted windows pulled up. This older gentleman in a nice suite jumped out and came running at me and started screaming in a thick possible Trinidadian or Guyanese accent, "Excuse me sir, excuse me. I have a quick question to ask." I said, "Sure, what's up?" He replied, "Do you know where the dead people are?" And got all bug-eyed and said, I don't know any dead people." He replied, "Heaven, hell, reincarnated? If you are unsure you need to learn about Jehovah and his glory, brother." He then handed me a religious pamphlet that said what to do when a loved one died, that shows a photo of a hysterical crying woman holding her hysterical crying son. He then said, "Read this to learn about death," then walked back to his car. I sat there and thought, damn, that's a nice car and nice suit, threw the pamphlet away and got a Swisher Sweet at the store, then left to go to deliver the food to the catering place. Pretty simple story, with an easy explanation, but it scared me at the moment. I used to drive a milk route and was put on a rural route after having an uptown area. It was mostly in an East Texas town known for its meth issue, and I would get out there in the truck around 3 a.m. Going down a very dark rural highway, 2 lanes, and the only lights were from the truck. I'm relaxed, just rolling straight down the road. Out of nowhere, a scraggly, skinny, stringy-haired person appears on a very busted bike and just rides across the road in front of me at 3 a.m., pitch black, like I wasn't going 60 miles per hour straight at them. I didn't even have time to hit the horn. They never even looked at me, just rode across with a wobbly front wheel like a cartoon, maybe going 5 miles per hour on a nice ride across the road. Made it to my first stop and whispered what into myself, because that was my second day running that route. My nephew was a deputy in a large rural county. Their shift rotation meant 11 p to 7 at every third week. The county has expansive wetlands and an enormous lake, so there are lots of bridges with no homes or other buildings for miles. One night on patrol in the wee hours he was driving across one of the bridges when he saw what a human form in the roadway was clearly. As he approached, he saw it was a woman, dressed very inappropriately for wintry weather. There was no vehicle to be seen, so he grew more puzzled by the second. He pulled alongside her, rolled down his window and asked if she needed help, but she didn't speak. He asked if he could call somebody for her, why he was getting a bit spooked, but again, no response. He radioed a colleague and when he turned his head back toward the woman there was nothing there. He used his spotlight, got out and looked down into the marsh, nothing. When he finished his shift and told his bestie, his friend had experienced the same encounter, on the same bridge. My nephew is an incredibly old-school religious guy, but he was flipped out by the very idea that spirits might actually exist in this realm, by in his church teachings that is sacrilege. Not me, my dad. He was far enough out that the only lights other than from his truck were from the stars and moon. One single headlight, motorcycle was the first impression, came up behind him at an extremely high rate of speed, but stopped behind him and trailed him for a few miles. No oncoming traffic this entire time. Finally, the headlight angled upwards and rose up in somewhat of a swooping motion and seemed to fly up and away. He shut his lights off going down the highway to try to see any signs of headlights behind him, but they were just gone. This was like a couple of hours into his shift with a home every night job, so hallucinations were not likely. My dad has been a truck driver going on 30 years. A few stories come to mind. Back when he used to be an owner/operator, he would carry his gun. Now working for a company, he only has a knife if that, at times. He has a dog that he takes on the road with him as his personal companion. It's good for him and the dog. One night, he was on a 10-hour break and waiting for the delivery the following morning. He was in the, seemingly, empty lot to the job site he was scheduled to deliver to the next morning. He was walking his dog before turning in for the night. He wasn't walking her with a leash because she is well trained, and he lets her roam because she usually just does her business and comes running back. Anyways, he's walking his dog, and out of the corner of his eye he spots a black shape making a beeline for his dog. Now mind you, his dog is a Shih Tzu, not exceptionally large. He turns to look, and the shape is this huge pit bull running at his dog like it's going to make her its next meal. My dad puts himself between his dog and this other dog, draws his knife, and screams, "Get out of here you goddamned mutt!" The pit bull stops in its tracks and its apparent owner comes running up to it with its leash, apologizing profusely. Not necessarily scary, I know, but scary if you're a small dog owner. Another story that comes to mind would be last winter. My dad was in upstate New York. He was running Interstate 86, I believe. I'd have to double check. So, my dad has this very distinguished whistle that he uses to call his dog back if she gets out of sight. It's something like an extremely high-pitched photo. I've never heard anyone whistle like it before, and his dog is the only dog that will respond to it. Anyways, he was on a dirt pull-off for the night and walking his dog. It was in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, no lights, no other vehicles, no noise, just forest and snow. He lost sight of his dog, so he called for her and whistled. When he whistled, he swears up and down he heard someone or something reciprocate that whistle, exactly as he had whistled it. He said it was enough for the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up, and when his dog got to him, he picked her up, carried her back to the truck, and locked the doors. It's the creepiest thing he's ever experienced according to him. There was also a time back when he used to work for a moving company over 15 years ago. He was pulled into a far side of a lot at a truck stop and an unsure-looking guy knocked at his door trying to coax him out with the excuse that his trailer doors were wide open. My dad checked the passenger mirror before he did anything and saw another, larger-looking man standing at the rear of the truck with a tire iron or some sort of blunt metal object. Needless to say, my dad put two and two together and told the guy that if he got out of the truck he was going to shoot them. He was an owner/operator back then. Lastly, there was the time when he was outside of Warren, Ohio a few years back and witnessed a man in a broke-down truck on the side of the road headed the opposite way get out of his truck and get hit by a car, so hard that he said he witnessed brain matter leave the man's skull. Scarred my dad enough that he did some research through public obituaries and found the family of the man and sent a sympathy card to them. My dad has been a truck driver going on 30 years. A few stories come to mind. Back when he used to be an owner/operator, he would carry his gun. Now working for a company, he only has a knife if that, at times. He has a dog that he takes on the road with him as his personal companion. It's good for him and the dog. One night, he was on a 10-hour break and waiting for the delivery the following morning. He was in the, seemingly, empty lot to the job site he was scheduled to deliver to the next morning. He was walking his dog before turning in for the night. He wasn't walking her with a leash because she is well trained, and he lets her roam because she usually just does her business and comes running back. Anyways, he's walking his dog, and out of the corner of his eye he spots a black shape making a beeline for his dog. Now mind you, his dog is a Shih Tzu, not exceptionally large. He turns to look, and the shape is this huge pit bull running at his dog like it's going to make her its next meal. My dad puts himself between his dog and this other dog, draws his knife, and screams, "Get out of here you goddamned mutt!" The pit bull stops in its tracks and its apparent owner comes running up to it with its leash, apologizing profusely. Not necessarily scary, I know, but scary if you're a small dog owner. Another story that comes to mind would be last winter. My dad was in upstate New York. He was running Interstate 86, I believe. I'd have to double check. So, my dad has this very distinguished whistle that he uses to call his dog back if she gets out of sight. It's something like an extremely high-pitched photo. I've never heard anyone whistle like it before, and his dog is the only dog that will respond to it. Anyways, he was on a dirt pull-off for the night and walking his dog. It was in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, no lights, no other vehicles, no noise, just forest and snow. He lost sight of his dog, so he called for her and whistled. When he whistled, he swears up and down he heard someone or something reciprocate that whistle, exactly as he had whistled it. He said it was enough for the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up, and when his dog got to him, he picked her up, carried her back to the truck, and locked the doors. It's the creepiest thing he's ever experienced according to him. There was also a time back when he used to work for a moving company over 15 years ago. He was pulled into a far side of a lot at a truck stop and an unsure-looking guy knocked at his door trying to coax him out with the excuse that his trailer doors were wide open. My dad checked the passenger mirror before he did anything and saw another, larger-looking man standing at the rear of the truck with a tire iron or some sort of blunt metal object. Needless to say, my dad put two and two together and told the guy that if he got out of the truck he was going to shoot them. He was an owner/operator back then. Lastly, there was the time when he was outside of Warren, Ohio a few years back and witnessed a man in a broke-down truck on the side of the road headed the opposite way get out of his truck and get hit by a car, so hard that he said he witnessed brain matter leave the man's skull. Scarred my dad enough that he did some research through public obituaries and found the family of the man and sent a sympathy card to them. In early October 2014 I was on holiday in a remote luxury safari ranch in the Samburu region of Kenya. The ranch had about 20 guests and maybe 20 staff and was situated in an extremely remote wilderness area. The nearest settlement was approximately 50 kilometers away, with staff living on site. We ate meals communally outside in a central patio area with a view over the landscape. There was a large mountain to one side that could be seen from where we were sitting. One night we were having a collective dinner with the other guests, and it was early evening, so people were pretty sober. It was dark and the night sky phenomenally clear. You could easily see the Milky Way and it was some of the clearest, most unpolluted skies I have ever seen. During the meal there was a hubbub and people stopped and stared, including the staff. We looked up and hovering roughly over the mountain was a large round green, black circle, which seemed to be pulsating. It was static for a few moments and seemed to swirl with green tendrils seeming to suck light in. It then began to move right to left across the mountain before suddenly fading out and disappearing. It was completely silent. All the guests and local staff had no idea what we saw. Bear in mind we're talking 20 plus people who saw this thing. Then as we walked out for our evening safari activity, a night drive, we could hear the radio network used by local lodges and the nearest settlement going berserk with everyone saying what the hell was that thing, it was seen 50 kilometers away. The guides, local natives in their 20s, told us that they had never seen anything like it in their entire lives and were utterly spooked out by it. We all went to bed a bit spooked out to put it mildly. I'm a military man and have served in a lot of odd places and seen a lot of odd things. I can assure you that this was not a military aviation asset, there were no navigation lights, and the color was fundamentally not normal. I don't know what I saw, but when I got back I spoke to a colleague who was a lifelong astronomer, and he couldn't tell me either. It's the only time in my life I'm prepared to say that I saw a UFO as it genuinely was an unidentified flying object. A story told to me by my grandfather. He swears he saw something weird one night when he was driving his semi through eastern Oregon in the late 70s. Said that there was a section of road where he could see some high voltage power lines off into the distance and there was this bright object sitting above it with this cloud of lightning coming off the wires, pointing up at it. Said he could understand something clearly at last casting shadows all over the hillsides as he drove along. He got far enough away and couldn't see it anymore. Never saw anything else weird. It freaks me out because my grandpa is not someone who believes in the supernatural, aliens, etc., and he isn't a tall tale when it comes to his stories. My mother told me the story first, said that he had told her about it one day not long after he had gotten home from the run and then didn't really want to talk about it anymore. I asked him about it one day when I was visiting. The story he told me matched up to what she had said his story had been. I was alone, driving a van load of large wooden packing crates from one end of the UK to the other, a few years ago. About 2 hours into the journey, something tapped me gently 3 times on the shoulder. I managed to keep my composure and said hello. There was no response, so after a few moments I turned round to look. One of the crate lids had come off, slid forward and somehow had just brushed my shoulder. Over a year ago I was driving through Louisville at midday with a friend who was interested in becoming a trucker. The sky was completely clear as we were passing the airport. I look up and see what looks like a big older military plane with propellers, ascending in the sky. It was incredibly vivid and not all the high off of the ground. What was very weird about it though was it looked like I was looking at an old TV. Everything about it was grayscale. I look at my mirrors to make sure I'm within my line and look back up and say, "You dude, look at that plane," and the plane was gone. Like just vanished. I looked away for maybe 3 seconds and there was nowhere it could be hiding. My friend replies, "What plane?" And I go on and explain what I saw and how it disappeared, and I'm freaking out. He banters me saying things like, "Oh boy, I have a hallucinating guy operating an 80,000 pounds of vehicle and I'm his passenger," and just joking that I'm going crazy. I had not given it much thought since but a few months ago, he called me and confessed that he saw the plane too. He didn't know why he didn't tell me. Creeps me out remembering it. Not creepy but scary. I drove flatbed for a few years. I was heading across Wyoming on I-80 just west of Cheyenne when a big snowstorm rolled in and they closed the road. I had to pull off at the Lincoln rest stop on top of Sherman Hill, 8,600-foot ASL Iris. It was 17 below with wind chill and 70 miles per hour wind gusts. I went to bed bunk heater on and shorts. I woke up a few hours later to below freezing temps in the truck, ice on the walls, near windows, and no feeling in my fingers. The bunk heaters don't like thin air sometimes and shut off. It took me 10 minutes using the palm of my hands to get the truck started up and get the engine heat going. I got it up into the 60s inside and was stuck on the mountain for 30 hours. Had I slept another 10 minutes, I wouldn't have woken up. Former truck driver here. Was teaming with my now husband in 1991. We had spent the entire day waiting to get loaded in Bend, Oregon, middle of the state. We were finally on our way across a lonely 2-lane highway. I'm driving first while B is in the bunk. Side note, I was a bit naive and skittish back then and he was always telling me not to panic when I come into an unusual situation. Well, after a few hours of heading back east, pitch black out, with extraordinarily little cars passing us in either direction, I came across a do not panic situation. I roll up on 2 orange cones sitting in the middle of each lane. So, roll to a stop, pull the brakes, and calmly wake B and tell him we have a situation. The opposite of skittish me, B was like, "Girl, run them cones over." But I was scared of the cones being put there by officials. I didn't want to move them. So, while I'm sitting there trying to figure out what to do with little to no help from a sleepy B, a car rolls up in the opposite direction. He stopped, inquired if I had put them there. I assured him I didn't. He assured me there was nothing behind him that warranted the cones. He ended up driving through the cones along the yellow line. Since I couldn't fit the truck between the 2 cones without running them over, I proclaimed to B, "I know what I'll do. I'll move the cones and put them back." He still teases me about that proclamation to this day. So, I climbed out and did my thing. While I'm going out there, another car passes me going in my direction. Doesn't stop, but apparently took notes. When I got back in to move the truck forward, I did make the wise decision to keep going and not put them back. So, we finally pulled into the next small town, and we pulled over to switch drivers. While pulled over, a police car rolls up on us. Bright blinding light bouncing off the mirror in my face. They had me step out and go to the back of the truck to talk to one officer while the other wanted to talk to B at cab. Another side note, B was still in the bunk, awake but pantsless, when they first told us to come out of the truck and I responded, "Can my partner put his pants on first?" Turns out the car that passed me in my direction got to town and flagged the police officers down that a Schneider truck was setting cones out in the middle of the road a little way out of town. So, after searching out truck for orange cones and after his officer getting a big chuckle at my expense, he told him are terrified I probably was right now and that they have set back the progress he had made on me. They let us go. Now, years, decades, later, I realize how lucky I was that I didn't get jumped when I got out the truck to move the cones. I'm sure it was an ambush situation similar to the body in the road fraud. Perhaps they didn't act because watching us they could tell there was a man in the bunk, and I wasn't a solo driver. A friend of mine's husband is an OTR driver. He told me a story last year. In California, he decided to stop for the night in this diner parking lot. Wasn't much else around, but he thought a hot coffee would feel wonderful. So, he hops off the truck, walks in. He's greeted by a beautiful lady named Jackie. She welcomes him, sits him down, and asks if he'd like some pancakes and coffee. He tells her he isn't hungry. She frowns and brings back some coffee and homemade pie. Tell him he needs to eat it. It's the most delicious thing he's ever tasted. Jackie sits down with him and talks for an hour. He realizes she's a special lady. An Elvis song comes on and he asks her to dance. After a couple of slow dances, she hands him a rose. He thanks her and she asks him to come back in before he leaves for a hot breakfast. He nods and heads out to his sleeper. I wake up to pounding on the window. The sheriff is outside and asks him if he's doing all right. He says yes sir. They get to talking a little and he tells the sheriff that he's leaving soon after he goes in to say his goodbyes to Jackie. Explains a little about how he really liked her. The sheriff stares at him bewildered and says, Jackie died 3 years ago. He motions to the diner that is run down and completely abandoned. The driver opens his truck and pulls out the rose he had left on the passenger seat. The sheriff takes a step back and tells him Jackie was known for putting fresh-cut roses on the tables. Apparently 3 men broke into the diner late one night and murdered Jackie during a robbery. The driver had no idea about any of this.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.